She sat completely still at the plaintiff's table, hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale. To anyone watching, she looked like the picture of defeat. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, her eyes lowered, her posture careful and contained, as though she were trying to make herself smaller than the wooden bench beneath her. Divorce court had a way of doing that to people. Most arrived angry or broken. She arrived silent. Her name was Eleanor Hart, and she had not spoken a single word since entering courtroom 3C that morning. The judge flipped through documents with the dull rhythm of someone who had seen this story thousands of times before. Another marriage dissolved, another division of assets, another quiet ending to something that had once felt permanent. Eleanor's attorney leaned toward her, whispering reassurances, suggesting objections, asking if she wanted to contest the valuation one last time. Eleanor did not respond. She didn't nod. She didn't shake her head. She simply stared at the table in front of her as if the grain of the wood were more important than anything happening around her. Across from her sat her husband, Victor Hart. He looked nothing like her. Victor was relaxed, almost buoyant. He sat back in his chair with one ankle resting casually over his knee, his arm draped along the backrest as if this were a boardroom meeting he had already won. His tailored suit fit him perfectly, the fabric crisp, the cufflinks expensive without being flashy. Every detail broadcast control, confidence, victory. He glanced at Eleanor with something close to amusement, the faintest curve of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. To him, her silence wasn't dignity, it was surrender. Victor leaned toward his lawyer and murmured something under his breath. The lawyer smirked, nodding once. The settlement was heavily in Victor's favor. He would keep the house, the company, the majority of the liquid assets. Eleanor would receive a modest payout, just enough to avoid looking cruel on paper. It was clean, efficient, legally airtight. Exactly how Victor liked things. The judge cleared her throat. "Mrs. Hart," she said, looking directly at Eleanor, "I need to confirm that you understand the terms of this agreement." Eleanor lifted her eyes slowly. For a brief moment, the courtroom felt suspended in that movement. Her gaze was calm, unreadable. Not angry, not pleading, just steady. "Yes, Your Honor," she said softly. Victor felt a small thrill run through him. That was it. No fight, no drama. He had expected tears, accusations, some last-ditch attempt to shame him in public. Instead, Eleanor had given him nothing. And nothing, Victor thought, was exactly what she deserved. The judge continued, "You understand that by signing this, you relinquish any claim to the marital residence, Hart Systems Incorporated, and all associated intellectual property." "Yes, Your Honor." Victor exhaled slowly, satisfaction settling deep in his chest. He had built Hart Systems from the ground up, or at least that was the version of the story he preferred. He had worked late nights, charmed investors, closed deals that others couldn't. Eleanor had been there in the early days, yes, but only in the background. Supportive, quiet, replaceable. The judge lifted her pen. "Very well. If there are no further objections..." The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. The sound was subtle, but it sliced through the stillness like a blade. Heads turned instinctively. Victor frowned, irritation flashing across his face. He hated interruptions, especially now, especially when he was seconds away from sealing the victory. 3 figures stood in the doorway. At the front was a tall man with silver hair and a composed, authoritative presence that commanded attention without effort. He wore a dark suit that looked understated but immaculately tailored. Behind him walked a woman and a younger man, both dressed formally, their expressions serious and focused. Victor's smile faltered. He recognized them immediately, though he hadn't seen them in years. Eleanor's family. Her father stepped forward first, his movements unhurried, deliberate. He didn't scan the room nervously. He didn't hesitate. He walked straight down the center aisle, as if he knew exactly where he was going and exactly what he intended to do once he arrived. Victor felt a flicker of annoyance. Of course. This was it, the emotional ambush, the last-minute attempt to guilt-trip him into giving up something out of pity. He leaned back, arms crossing over his chest. already preparing himself to dismiss whatever speech was about to follow. The judge frowned. "Sir," she said, gavel tapping lightly against the bench, "this is an active hearing." "I understand, Your Honor," the man replied, his voice calm, resonant, controlled. "My name is Thomas Caldwell. I'm here on behalf of my daughter." Eleanor didn't move. She didn't look back. But something subtle shifted in her posture, a barely perceptible easing of tension, like someone exhaling after holding their breath for too long. Victor's lawyer leaned forward, whispering urgently, "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. These individuals are not parties to the case." Thomas stopped a few feet from the rail separating the gallery from the courtroom floor. He met the judge's gaze without flinching. "That depends," he said evenly, "on what you believe is being decided here today." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Victor laughed quietly under his breath, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "She's already signed." Thomas turned his attention to Victor for the first time. The look he gave him wasn't angry. It wasn't pleading. It was assessing, like a man studying a structure and already seeing the cracks hidden beneath the surface. "Not yet," Thomas said. The judge hesitated, then raised a hand. "We will take a brief recess," she announced. 10 minutes. The gavel struck. Victor stood abruptly, heart beginning to pound for the first time that morning. 10 minutes. That was all it took for certainty to turn into unease. And Eleanor, still seated, finally allowed herself the smallest of smiles. The hallway outside courtroom 3C filled quickly with low voices and restless movement. Lawyers clustered in tight circles, murmuring into phones. A clerk hurried past, heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Victor stood near the wall, jaw tight, arms crossed, irritation simmering just beneath the surface. 10 minutes ago, this had been over. Clean, controlled. Now his victory sat paused by a man who had no business being here. He turned to his lawyer, lowering his voice. "Explain," Victor said. Don't tell me this is just theatrics." His lawyer adjusted his glasses, already scrolling through documents on his tablet. "I don't think it is," he replied carefully. "That man, Thomas Caldwell, he's not just some emotional relative. I recognize the name." Victor scoffed. "From where? PTA meetings?" The lawyer didn't smile. From filings, from corporate registries, from trusts. Victor felt a flicker of unease. "What does that have to do with this?" "It might have everything to do with it," the lawyer said. "Give me a minute." Across the hall, Eleanor stood beside her family for the first time that day. Her mother squeezed her hand gently, eyes soft with concern but steady with resolve. Her younger brother hovered close, protective without being overbearing. And her father, Thomas, stood, slightly apart, his presence solid, grounding. Eleanor finally exhaled fully, the tension she'd been carrying since morning easing just a fraction. "You okay?" her mother asked quietly. Eleanor nodded. "I am now." Thomas studied her face, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly. "Just stay calm. Let them talk." Victor watched them from across the hallway, irritation curdling into suspicion. Eleanor looked different now, straighter, less diminished. He didn't like that. He didn't like feeling as though the balance of the room had shifted without his permission. He stepped forward, forcing a smile. "Thomas," he said, voice smooth. "Long time. This really isn't necessary." Thomas turned slowly to face him. "Most important things aren't," he replied. Victor's smile tightened. "Whatever you think you're doing, it's too late. The agreement is done." Thomas tilted his head slightly. "Agreements are only as strong as what they're built on." Victor laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "You always did love vague warnings." "I prefer preparation," Thomas said calmly. The courtroom doors opened again, signaling the end of the recess. Victor's lawyer caught his arm. "Victor," he said quietly, "we need to be careful." Victor pulled his arm free. "I'm not afraid of a retired accountant and a family reunion," he snapped. Inside, the atmosphere had changed. The judge no longer looked bored. She looked alert, curious. Papers had been rearranged. A clerk whispered something in her ear before taking her seat. "Mr. Caldwell," the judge said, once everyone had settled, "you may proceed. Briefly." Thomas stepped forward, placing a slim folder on the podium. "Your Honor," he began. My daughter has agreed to terms today under the assumption that certain assets belong solely to her husband. I am here to demonstrate that assumption is incorrect. Victor shot to his feet. Objection, he barked. This is a divorce proceeding, not a business dispute. The judge raised a hand. Sit down, Mr. Hart. You'll have your chance. Victor sat, pulse quickening. Thomas continued. Hart Systems Incorporated relies on a core platform known internally as Meridian Framework, he said. That framework was developed over a decade ago by Eleanor before her marriage. The intellectual property was placed into a private family trust for protection. Victor felt his stomach tighten. That's not true, he muttered. Thomas opened the folder, producing documents. The trust owns the framework, he said. Hart Systems licenses it. Victor's lie. R leaned forward sharply, eyes scanning the pages now being handed to the judge. His face drained of color. Victor, he whispered urgently, did you ever personally verify ownership of Meridian? Victor swallowed. Of course I did. His lawyer shook his head slowly. No. You assumed. The judge adjusted her glasses, reading carefully. These documents, she said, appear to predate the marriage. Yes, Your Honor, Thomas replied. By several years. Victor felt heat rise in his chest. This is absurd, he snapped. She worked on that code as part of the company. Eleanor finally spoke. Her voice was calm, measured. I licensed it to the company, she said. I never gave it away. The courtroom fell silent. Victor stared at her, disbelief flashing across his face. You never said. You never asked, Eleanor replied. The judge leaned back, fingers steepled. If this is accurate, she said slowly, then the valuation of Hart Systems is materially affected. Victor's lawyer whispered, panic creeping into his voice. If the license is revoked, it can't be, Victor hissed. It absolutely can, the lawyer replied. And if it is, you're exposed. Victor's confidence cracked. He looked at Thomas, then back at Eleanor. What do you want? He demanded. Money. Eleanor shook her head. I want the truth acknowledged. The judge nodded once. We will pause proceedings, she said. I am ordering a temporary hold pending verification of these claims. The gavel struck again. Victor felt the room spin slightly as certainty collapsed into chaos. His perfect ending had vanished, replaced by questions he couldn't control. And Eleanor, standing beside her family, Finn. Ali felt seen. Victor barely heard the murmurs that followed the judge's decision. The courtroom had transformed from a predictable stage into unstable ground, and for the first time, he no longer knew where to place his feet. He sat rigid in his chair as clerks moved with renewed urgency, documents changing hands, whispers spreading like ripples through still water. His lawyer leaned close again, voice tight. This isn't a delay, he said. This is a fracture. Victor clenched his jaw. Fix it. His lawyer hesitated. I don't know if I can. They were ushered back into the hallway while the judge's staff verified the documents. The atmosphere felt heavier now, charged with possibility and danger. Victor paced near the wall, pulling out his phone, firing off messages to advisors and executives. No one responded quickly enough. His eyes flicked toward Eleanor again. She was seated on a bench with her family around her, her posture calm, almost serene. It infuriated him. She was supposed to be unraveling. Instead, she looked anchored. He approached her, stopping a few steps away. You planned this, he said quietly, anger slipping through his controlled tone. Eleanor looked up at him, unflinching. I prepared, she replied. There's a difference. Victor laughed bitterly. You let me believe you had nothing. I had what I needed, she said. You just didn't value it. Thomas stood then, placing himself subtly between them. You should step back, he said to Victor. It wasn't a threat. It didn't need to be. Victor scoffed and turned away, but his confidence felt thin now, brittle. He returned to his lawyer, who was scrolling frantically through old filings. Victor, the lawyer said, voice barely above a whisper. There's more. Victor's stomach dropped. What do you mean more? The trust doesn't just own the framework, the lawyer said. It owns the patents, the extensions, every update that made the platform viable for enterprise clients. Victor stared at him. "That's impossible. It's documented," the lawyer replied, "and notarized." The courtroom doors opened again. Everyone was called back inside. The judge took her seat, expression grave. "I have reviewed the preliminary verification," she said. "The trust appears legitimate. The licensing agreement is valid." Victor felt his pulse roar in his ears. "Mrs. Hart," the judge continued, turning to Eleanor, "are you revoking the license?" Eleanor paused. For the first time, the room waited on her. She took a breath. "Not immediately," she said, "but I reserve the right." Victor surged to his feet. "You can't do this," he snapped. "You'll destroy the company." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "You built it on borrowed ground," she said. "That was your choice." The judge raised her gavel slightly. "Mr. Hart," she said sharply, "control yourself." Victor sat, hands trembling slightly now. The image he had so carefully constructed, himself as the architect, the owner, the victor, was crumbling under scrutiny. The judge continued. "Given these developments, the settlement must be re-evaluated." She turned to Victor's lawyer. "Counsel, you will advise your client accordingly." Victor's lawyer swallowed hard. "Yes, Your Honor." The proceedings paused again, but this time there was no sense of routine. Victor felt cornered. He leaned toward his lawyer. "What happens if she revokes?" "It," he whispered. The lawyer didn't hesitate. "The company collapses," he said. "Contracts voided, investors panic, regulatory scrutiny." Victor's mind raced. There had to be leverage. There was always leverage. He glanced at Eleanor again, at her family, at Thomas's calm, unwavering presence. Something twisted inside him. "She won't," he said softly. "She's not ruthless enough." But as he watched Eleanor speak quietly with her mother, a realization crept in. This wasn't ruthlessness. It was resolve. The judge called them back one final time that day. "I'm ordering a full audit," she announced. "Until then, no assets tied to Hart Systems will be transferred." Victor felt the floor drop out from under him. This wasn't just about the divorce anymore. This was about everything. As they filed out, Victor caught up to Eleanor one last time. "You think this ends well for you?" he asked, voice low. Eleanor turned, her expression composed. "It already has," she said. "I'm no longer invisible." Victor watched her walk away with her family, a cold dread settling in his chest. For the first time he understood that silence was not the absence of power. It was where power waited. The audit began the following morning, swift and unrelenting. Victor arrived at his office to find unfamiliar faces already seated in conference rooms, laptops open, voices low and efficient. They introduced themselves politely, professionally, and without warmth. Government regulators, independent forensic accountants, people whose job was not to negotiate but to verify. Victor had spent years controlling narratives. These people dealt only in facts. He retreated to his office, closing the door, harder than necessary. His lawyer followed him in, loosening his tie. "This is bad," he said without preamble. "Worse than yesterday." Victor turned sharply. "Don't dramatize." The lawyer met his gaze. "I'm not. They're pulling historical licensing logs, every renewal, every modification. They're going back further than we ever did." Victor sank into his chair, mind racing. "We've always paid the licensing fees," he said. "That counts for something. It counts as evidence," the lawyer replied, "of dependency." Across town, Eleanor sat in a quiet conference room of her own, a space she had rarely been invited into before. Her family surrounded her, but she was the one answering questions now. Calmly, precisely. She explained timelines, development phases, decisions made years ago that had seemed small at the time. The auditors listened closely, impressed by her clarity. This wasn't someone scrambling to protect herself. This was someone who had built something and knew it intimately. Victor's phone buzzed incessantly. Executives wanted reassurance. Investors wanted explanations. Victor gave neither. He spoke in vague phrases about temporary reviews and procedural delays, hoping confidence alone might still buy him time. But confidence without substance was thin, and people could feel it. By afternoon, the first crack appeared publicly. A junior analyst leaked word of the audit. The stock dipped. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Victor watched the numbers shift on his screen, each percentage point tightening the knot in his chest. He called his lawyer again. "We need to pressure her," he said. "This ends if she reaffirms the license." The lawyer hesitated. "Pressure me?" "At backfire." "Everything backfires," Victor snapped. "At least this way I'm doing something." He requested a private meeting with Eleanor. They met in a neutral conference room at the courthouse, no lawyers present. Eleanor sat across from him, hands folded, expression unreadable. Victor tried to soften his tone. "We don't have to do this the hard way," he said. "You revoke the license, everyone loses." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "Everyone already lost," she replied. "You just didn't notice because you were winning." Victor leaned forward. "I can make this worth your while." Eleanor shook her head. "You still think this is about money, isn't it?" he asked. Eleanor's voice was quiet but firm. "It's about being erased. I won't let that happen again." Victor felt frustration surge. "You're being vindictive." Eleanor didn't flinch. "I'm being accurate." The meeting ended without resolution. Victor returned to his office to find another message waiting. The auditors had discovered inconsistencies in past disclosures. Nothing criminal yet, but enough to justify deeper scrutiny. Victor's lawyer's voice shook when he relayed the news. "If they dig far enough," he said, "they might start asking why the license renewals were automated without board oversight." Victor stared out the window, the city blurring slightly. "Because it was efficient," he said weakly. The lawyer didn't respond. Eleanor spent that evening at her parents' home, sitting at the kitchen table she had grown up at. The familiarity grounded her. Her mother poured tea. Her father watched quietly, pride mixed with concern. "This will get harder," he said. Eleanor nodded. "I know. Are you ready?" he asked. Eleanor met his eyes. "I've been ready for years." The next morning, Victor arrived to find federal officials waiting. The tone had shifted. Questions were sharper. Records were requested, not asked for. Victor complied, sweating beneath his composed exterior. He realized then that this was no longer a chess match. It was an excavation, and once digging started, it rarely stopped where you wanted it to. News outlets picked up the story. Not Eleanor's silence, but Victor's exposure. Headlines framed him as reckless, arrogant, careless with governance. The narrative he had curated collapsed under scrutiny. Investors pulled back. Partners paused negotiations. The company's value slid further. Victor sat alone in his office late that night, lights dimmed, phone silent for the first time in days. He thought of the courtroom, of Eleanor's stillness. He had mistaken quiet for weakness. Now he understood it had been discipline, and discipline, once unleashed, did not need to raise its voice. Victor stopped sleeping. Not the restless kind of sleeplessness he had known during deal negotiations or hostile takeovers, but something heavier, something hollow. He lay awake at night staring at the ceiling of his penthouse, replaying conversations, decisions, moments he had dismissed without a second thought. Each memory now felt like a warning he had ignored. The audit intensified. What began as a review of licensing agreements expanded into a full forensic examination of Heart Systems' governance practices. Board approvals were scrutinized. Internal controls questioned. Emails pulled from archives Victor hadn't opened in years. The phrase "pattern of negligence" began a ring in conversations, spoken carefully but with growing frequency. Victor's lawyer called him early one morning. "They've escalated," he said. "Regulators want to know why the board was never informed that the company's core platform was externally owned." Victor rubbed his eyes. "Because it didn't matter," he said. "It worked." "That's not an answer," the lawyer replied. "That's an admission." Across the city, Eleanor sat in a modest office that had once belonged to a mid-level engineer. She hadn't asked for Victor's old corner suite. The view meant nothing to her. What mattered was proximity, to the systems, to the people who actually kept the company running. Engineers stopped by her door with questions now, not out of fear, out of trust. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was precise, calm, grounded in detail. She knew the architecture of the platform better than anyone else in the building because she had designed it. She understood its vulnerabilities because she had patched them quietly for years, often late at night, often without acknowledgement. The same patience that had sustained her through her marriage now guided her leadership. Victor attempted damage control. He issued internal memos stressing stability. He scheduled meetings with investors, assuring them the audit was procedural. His voice was confident, but something in it rang false now. People noticed. Confidence without credibility felt like noise. Meetings ended with polite nods and unanswered emails. One afternoon, Victor was summoned to a regulatory interview. He sat across from two officials in a stark room, no windows, no distractions. They asked simple questions. Who owned the intellectual property? Why were disclosures incomplete? Why had automated license renewals been approved without oversight? Victor answered carefully at first, then defensively. Finally, he grew quiet, because the truth was uncomfortable. He had assumed, he had delegated, he had trusted his version of reality more than the documents that contradicted it. In his mind, success had validated everything that came before it. The regulators didn't care about success, they cared about process. When Victor returned to his office, he found another message waiting. A major client had suspended their contract pending the outcome of the audit. The company's stock dipped again, not a crash, a slow bleed, the kind that frightened people more. Eleanor received the same news differently. She gathered her team and explained the situation honestly. No grand speeches, no reassurances she couldn't guarantee. Just facts, what they were facing, what they could control, what they couldn't. The room was quiet, but it wasn't tense. People appreciated clarity. They always had. That evening, Eleanor visited her parents again. Her father listened as she described the pressure building around the company. "You didn't ask for this," he said gently. Eleanor shook her head. "I didn't ask for the marriage either," she replied. "But I chose what to do when it ended." Victor, meanwhile, sat alone in his office long after midnight. The city lights glittered below him, distant and indifferent. He thought about the early days, the nights Eleanor had stayed up debugging while he slept, the contracts she had read while he chased headlines. He had called her cautious, risk-averse, small-minded. Now, he realized she had been thorough. The audit reached a critical point when investigators identified discrepancies in how Hart Systems had represented ownership during a government bid. Nothing overtly fraudulent, but misleading enough to raise alarms. Victor's lawyer's voice trembled when he delivered the news. "They're considering a referral," he said. "Just in case." Victor felt something cold settle in his chest. Referral meant escalation. Escalation meant consequences beyond corporate embarrassment. He called Eleanor. She answered after the third ring. "What do you want?" she asked calmly. "I need you to reinstate the license permanently," Victor said without preamble. "We can renegotiate terms, equity, control, anything." There was a pause. Then Eleanor spoke. "You still think I want something from you," she said. "I don't." Victor clenched his fist. "If this company collapses—" "It won't," she interrupted. "Not because of me, because it was never built on you alone." She ended the call. Victor stared at his phone, the silence louder than any argument. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be truly exposed, not financially, not legally, but internally. There was no one left to blame, no opponent to overpower, no narrative to spin, only consequences. The referral became official 3 days later. Victor read the email twice before it sank in. Federal regulators were escalating the matter for further review. It was written in neutral language, almost polite, but Victor understood what lay beneath it. This was no longer just about governance failures or sloppy disclosures. This was about intent, responsibility, and accountability. The kinds of things that didn't resolve quietly. His lawyer arrived at the office within the hour, face drawn. "We need to prepare for the worst," he said. Victor scoffed weakly. "You've been saying that for weeks." "This is different," the lawyer replied. "They're bringing in criminal analysts, not to charge you yet, but to determine if charges are appropriate." Victor sat heavily in his chair. The room felt smaller than it ever had, the walls closing in despite the glass and skyline. "I didn't steal anything," he said. "I didn't hack anything. I built a company." The lawyer nodded slowly. "Intent isn't always about theft," he said. "Sometimes it's about willful blindness." Victor dismissed him soon after, claiming exhaustion. He needed time alone, time to think, but thinking brought no relief. His mind looped endlessly through the same realization. Everything he had relied on, assumptions, shortcuts, confidence, was now evidence against him. That night, unable to sleep, Victor walked through the apartment, touching objects as if they might ground him. The art on the walls, the expensive furniture chosen more for appearance than comfort. None of it felt real anymore. It all felt temporary, borrowed. Like the company. Across the city, Eleanor faced a different kind of pressure. Employees were anxious. Rumors spread quickly, some exaggerated, some dangerously accurate. Eleanor addressed them directly, holding an all-hands meeting in the largest conference room. She didn't sugarcoat the situation. "We're under scrutiny," she said. "That doesn't mean we're guilty. It means we need to be transparent, disciplined, and patient." Someone asked if the company would survive. Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She looked around the room, at faces she recognized, at people who had stayed long nights fixing problems they hadn't created. "Yes," she said finally, "because the work matters, and because we're willing to do it the right way." The room exhaled collectively. Victor, meanwhile, was summoned for an interview. The room was stark. Two analysts sat across from him, one flipping through a tablet, the other watching him carefully. They asked about the licensing structure, the automated renewals, the board's lack of awareness. Victor answered calmly at first, relying on the polished confidence that had carried him through countless negotiations. But confidence didn't impress them. Details did. When they asked why he had never verified ownership personally, Victor hesitated. "I trusted my team," he said. The analysts nodded. "And when questions arose?" Victor swallowed. They didn't. The analyst's gaze didn't waver. "That's the problem." The interview lasted hours. By the end, Victor felt drained, exposed. He had spoken more in that room than Eleanor had spoken during the entire divorce proceeding. And yet, somehow, he felt he had said far less of value. News broke later that evening. Not a headline, just a mention buried in an article about regulatory oversight. Heart systems under federal review. Victor's name appeared, followed by words like scrutiny and potential misconduct. It was enough. Investors reacted. Partners hesitated. The stock dipped again. Victor called his lawyer in a panic. "We need a counter-narrative," he said. "We need to show leadership." The lawyer sighed. "Leadership would be stepping aside," he said quietly. "Fifth." Victor froze. "You want me to resign?" "I want you to protect yourself," the lawyer replied. "And the company." The suggestion felt like betrayal. Victor had never stepped aside from anything, but the truth was unavoidable. His presence was now a liability. The board convened an emergency meeting. Victor joined remotely, face composed, voice steady. He framed his potential resignation as a strategic decision, a temporary measure. The board members listened politely. Some avoided eye contact. When the vote came, it was unanimous. Victor Hart would step down as CEO effective immediately. The announcement was released within the hour. Eleanor read it on her phone while walking through the engineering floor. She stopped, absorbing the words. There was no surge of triumph, just a quiet acknowledgement. This, too, was inevitable. She continued walking, nodding to an engineer who smiled nervously at her. "We'll be okay," she said gently. And she meant it. Victor packed his office that evening. Boxes replaced the polished surfaces that had once displayed awards and accolades. He worked slowly, methodically, as if each item required careful consideration. When he finished, he stood in the empty room for a long moment, listening to the silence. For the first time, there was no title attached to his name, only questions, and somewhere beneath them, a growing awareness that this was not the end of his unraveling, but the beginning of it. Victor's resignation did not bring the relief he had expected. If anything, it accelerated the unraveling. Without the shield of his position, scrutiny intensified. Requests for interviews became subpoenas. Casual inquiries hardened into formal demands. He moved out of the penthouse within a week, not because he had to, but because he could no longer stand the emptiness of it. The space had been designed to impress. Now it only echoed. He relocated to a smaller apartment across town, sparsely furnished, temporary in every sense. For the first time in decades, Victor woke up without a schedule dictated by meetings and deadlines. The silence felt unnatural. He filled it obsessively: news, updates, legal documents, endless calls with his attorney. Each day brought new information, none of it comforting. The formal investigation concluded what the auditors had already implied. While there was no evidence of outright theft, there was overwhelming proof of willful negligence. Victor had signed disclosures without verification. He had approved representations that were technically inaccurate. He had allowed automated systems to replace oversight because it was easier. The distinction between ignorance and responsibility collapsed under examination. His lawyer laid it out plainly. "They may not frame this as criminal fraud," he said, "but civil penalties are almost certain. And if any government contracts are implicated, that's another story." Victor stared at the wall, feeling a familiar coldness settle into his chest. He had always believed that staying just inside the lines was enough. He was learning, too late, that leadership demanded more than that. Eleanor, meanwhile, was formally appointed interim CEO. The board's decision was not dramatic, it was practical. She understood the technology, she understood the risks, and most importantly, she understood what had been ignored. When the announcement was made internally, the response was muted but steady. No applause, no outrage, just a sense of cautious alignment. People trusted her because she had never pretended to be someone else. Her first act was not to restructure, but to listen. She held small meetings with teams across the company, asking questions Victor had never bothered to ask. Where were the bottlenecks? What systems worried them? What had been patched quietly instead of properly fixed? The answers came slowly at first, then more freely. Eleanor took notes. She didn't promise immediate solutions, she promised honesty. Victor watched from a distance as news articles began referring to the company without his name attached. Under new leadership, they said. The phrasing stung more than he expected. It was as if he had been erased not by scandal, but by irrelevance. He had always believed his presence was essential. The company's continued operation challenged that belief relentlessly. One afternoon, Victor was called in for a deposition. The room was smaller than he expected, the atmosphere formal and unyielding. Lawyers sat across from him, voices calm, questions precise. They asked about decision-making processes, about his understanding of the licensing structure, about why he had never questioned the renewals. Victor answered truthfully, because there was no advantage left in evasion. Each admission felt like shedding a layer of armor he had worn too long. When it was over, he sat alone in the hallway, hands clasped loosely, feeling older than his years. He thought about Eleanor again, not with resentment, but with a growing sense of clarity. She had not taken anything from him. She had simply stepped forward when he had stepped aside. The difference mattered. Back at the company, Eleanor faced her own challenges. Stabilizing operations was one thing, rebuilding trust was another. Clients wanted reassurance. Regulators wanted transparency. Employees wanted certainty. Eleanor navigated each with the same steady approach. She didn't rush. She documented. She invited oversight rather than resisting it. Slowly, the pressure eased. Her family remained close during this time, offering support without interference. Her father watched with quiet pride as she handled situations that would have overwhelmed her years ago. "You've grown into this," he said one evening. Eleanor smiled. "I think I always was," she replied. "I just stopped hiding." Victor received notice of the settlement weeks later. The penalties were severe but survivable. Financial losses, restrictions, a permanent mark on his professional record. He signed the papers without protest. Fighting now would only prolong the inevitable. As he walked out of the building afterward, the air felt different, lighter, not because things were better, but because they were finally real. That night he sat alone in his new apartment, no screens on, no calls. Scheduled. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the weight of everything he had ignored. The marriage, the company, the people he had overlooked. It was painful, but it was also clarifying. Eleanor stood in her office late that same night, lights dimmed, reviewing one last report before heading home. She looked around the room, not the corner suite, not the symbols of power, but a space defined by work. It felt right. Two lives had diverged sharply from the same courtroom. One built on control had collapsed under its own assumptions. The other, built quietly and patiently, was finally being allowed to stand. The final phase unfolded without spectacle. There were no cameras when the investigation officially closed, no public reckoning beyond a brief press release filled with careful language and measured conclusions. Victor Hart became a case study rather than a headline, a name referenced in footnotes about governance failures and leadership blind spots. He read the announcement alone, seated at the small kitchen table of his apartment, the paper lying flat beneath his palms. When he finished, he folded it once and set it aside. There was nothing left to argue with. Life adjusted around the absence of his former identity. Victor found work slowly, cautiously, under advisory roles that came with limitations and conditions. No executive authority, no decision-making power without oversight. At first, the restrictions felt humiliating. Later, they felt instructive. He learned to offer input without dominance, to contribute without control. The habits came slowly, like muscles relearning unfamiliar movements. Some days he resented it. Other days he recognized, relief of no longer needing to perform certainty he didn't possess. He thought about Eleanor more often than he admitted, though not with longing, with recognition. He began to understand how much of her strength had been forged in silence, how much of his weakness had been hidden behind volume. The realization did not excuse his choices, but it reframed them. That mattered. Eleanor, for her part, declined the title of interim CEO when the board offered to make it permanent. She insisted on a formal process, on external review, on accountability. When she was appointed officially weeks later, it felt earned rather than granted. Her leadership did not announce itself. It settled in. The company changed under her guidance, not dramatically, not overnight. Systems were rebuilt methodically. Oversight structures were strengthened. Teams that had once operated in isolation were brought together, encouraged to communicate rather than compete. Eleanor spent less time speaking at the front of rooms and more time listening at the back. The effect was subtle but cumulative. People stayed. Problems surfaced earlier. Fixes lasted longer. Her family remained a quiet presence in her life, steady and grounding. Her father watched the transformation with a sense of closure. He had worried once that protecting Eleanor would require confrontation. Instead, it had required patience. He saw now that she had never needed rescuing. She had needed space. On a quiet afternoon months later, Eleanor returned to the courthouse alone. Not for business, not for obligation. She stood for a moment in the hallway outside Courtroom 3C, observing the flow of strangers moving in and out, carrying their own endings and beginnings. She did not feel anger. She did not feel triumph. She felt distance, the kind that comes from having moved past something completely. Victor never returned. His life continued in smaller increments, less dramatic, more honest. He learned a discipline of restraint, the value of asking questions he once ignored. There were moments of regret, but they no longer consumed him. Regret became a reminder rather than a sentence. He carried it without dramatizing it. Years passed. Heart systems became something else entirely, rebranded quietly, restructured deliberately. Under Eleanor's leadership, it earned a reputation for stability rather than spectacle. Clients trusted it not because it promised everything, but because it delivered consistently. Eleanor never corrected people when they credited her success to timing or circumstance. She knew better. Timing only mattered if you were prepared. Victor read about the company occasionally, always briefly. He did not reach out. Some connections were meant to remain resolved, not reopened. He accepted that. On a rare evening of reflection, Victor sat by his window, city lights flickering beyond the glass. He thought about the moment in court when Eleanor had sat silent while he celebrated. He finally understood what he had been witnessing. Not weakness, not resignation. Strategy, composure. The discipline to wait until the right moment to speak. That understanding. G arrived without bitterness. Elsewhere, Eleanor closed her laptop at the end of another long day. She paused in the doorway of her office, listening to the quiet hum of systems running smoothly. The silence no longer felt like something to endure. It felt like confirmation. Two people had entered the same courtroom believing different things about power. One believed power was declared, defended loudly, reinforced through dominance. The other believed power was maintained quietly, protected patiently, revealed only when necessary. The courtroom had decided nothing. They had decided everything themselves. Time moved forward, indifferent to reputation and unkind to assumptions. It rewarded preparation. It punished neglect. It revealed, eventually, what had always been true. Eleanor walked into the evening with steady steps, unburdened by the need to prove anything. Victor turned off the light in his apartment and sat with the dark, no longer afraid of it. The story did not end with a bang or a verdict. It ended with clarity,